A black woman in handcuffs. A corrupt judge ready to bury her. Racist cops smirking, thinking they've won. But when the courtroom doors swing open, gasps fill the air. Michaela Brown isn't just the defendant anymore. She's their new boss. Now, it's their turn to face justice. Redwood Heights had always been a city where power dictated justice. And for decades, that power rested in the hands of corrupt officers who twisted the law for their own gain. Among them, Detective Carl Drummond and Sergeant Ian Collins were the worst of the worst, officers who thrived on fear, manipulation, and deeply embedded racism. Their specialty? Framing innocent black residents. For years, Drummond and Collins had orchestrated false charges, planted evidence, and turned minor offenses into life-ruining felonies. They worked in the shadows, making sure their victims had no way out. And now, they had their sights set on Michaela Brown. Michaela was not just another victim. She was a problem. A rising legal star. She had spent years exposing police misconduct, challenging wrongful arrests, and standing up for those the system tried to silence. She was never afraid to call out corruption, even in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her. And that made her dangerous. Drummond and Collins knew that if Michaela continued to rise, she could bring down everything they had built. She had influence. She had respect. And worst of all, she had the truth on her side. So, they decided to act, before it was too late. The plan was carefully crafted, every detail meticulously arranged. Drummond and Collins needed to make Michaela's downfall so brutal, so undeniable, that no one would question it. They started with her finances, forging bank records that linked her to illicit money transfers. Then came the burner phone, filled with fabricated text messages implicating her in drug trafficking. And the final touch? Planted evidence. Late one night, under the cover of darkness, Drummond and Collins broke into Michaela's home. They wore gloves, their faces covered, moving with the precision of seasoned criminals. Inside, they stashed bags of a white powdery substance, carefully packaged to resemble cocaine, under her kitchen sink and in her bedroom closet. They planted a fake ledger, filled with names, dates, and numbers, all pointing to her supposed involvement in a massive drug operation. By the time they left, the trap was set. The next morning, Redwood Heights police mobilized. A SWAT team, fully armed, tactical gear, riot shields, descended on Michaela's neighborhood. They wanted a show. They wanted the entire community to witness what happened when someone dared to challenge them. As Michaela sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and reviewing case notes, her front door exploded open. "Get on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" Dozens of officers stormed her home, rifles raised. Stunned, Michaela barely had time to react before she was yanked out of her chair and slammed to the cold hardwood floor. Neighbors watched in horror as cameras flashed, news vans arrived, and cops dragged her outside like a dangerous fugitive. Her grandmother, Bernice Brown, stood at the edge of the sidewalk screaming in protest. "She has done nothing. Let her go! Let her go!" Drummond and Collins stood by, watching the chaos unfold, smug, satisfied. "You should have stayed in your lane, Michaela," Drummond sneered as he slapped the cuffs on her wrists. Michaela's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she was innocent. But innocence did not matter when the system was designed to bury people like her. As the police shoved her into the back of a squad car, she caught a glimpse of Judge Mark Porter watching from across the street. He looked nervous, but not enough to stop what was happening, because he was in on it too. Judge Porter, deep in gambling debt, had taken a bribe from Drummond and Collins. In exchange, he had signed off on the bogus warrant that led to Michaela's arrest. Now, as the car pulled away, Michaela felt the weight of her situation crashing down on her. They had set her up. They had destroyed her life. Or so they thought. They believe they have won. But Michaela is not done fighting. Michaela Brown sat in the back of the police transport van, her wrists cuffed tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold metal seat beneath her did nothing to cool the fire burning inside. She knew she was innocent. She had spent years studying the law, fighting for justice. And now she was being crushed by the very system she had sworn to uphold. The ride to Redwood Heights County Jail felt endless. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated her reflection in the metal divider. She saw her own face, determined, angry, but not broken. She could not afford to break. By the time they arrived, the booking process was already in motion. Officers took her fingerprints, her mugshot, and confiscated her belongings. She felt stripped of her dignity, reduced to nothing but an inmate number. Step forward, hands behind your back. She did as told, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. The worst part? She could see the smirks on the faces of Detective Drummond and Sergeant Collins, standing behind the glass, watching like predators admiring their latest kill. Collins leaned toward the officer processing her. Make sure she gets a nice cold cell. Let her soak in her new reality. Michaela gritted her teeth but said nothing. They wanted her to react. They wanted to see her break. She refused. As Michaela sat in her holding cell, the city of Redwood Heights erupted with the news of her arrest. The same journalists who once praised her work now plastered her face across headlines. Breaking. Community activist Michaela Brown arrested in major drug trafficking bust. How the mighty have fallen. Michaela Brown's shocking double life exposed. Evidence confirms Brown's connection to multi-state drug operations. It was all lies. The media ran with the police's story without question. News anchors repeated the fabricated evidence as if it were fact. Opinion pieces dissected how someone so respected could be a criminal all along. The people of Redwood Heights were divided. Some refused to believe it. She has fought for this community for years. There is no way she would be involved in drugs. But others? They swallowed the lie whole. See? They always act righteous, but look at what they do behind closed doors. Michaela had spent years fighting for justice, and now justice had turned its back on her. On her second day in jail, Michaela finally met her lawyer, Glenn Winters. He was a public defender, a good man, but overworked, underpaid, and outnumbered. He walked into the visitation room with a tired but kind expression. A folder stuffed with documents was tucked under his arm. "Miss Brown," he said, setting the folder down, "I believe you are innocent." Michaela's eyes met his, filled with exhaustion, but also defiance. "Then help me prove it." Glenn sighed, rubbing his forehead. "The problem is the evidence. There is a lot of it. It is fake. Every last piece of it." "I believe you," Glenn said quickly. "But believing you and proving it in court are two different things." He pulled out a thick police report, flipping through the pages. "They have text messages, financial records, a burner phone, and drugs found in your home," he listed off. "It is a strong case, too strong. Almost too perfect." Michaela sat up. "Exactly. They built this case to bury me." Glenn nodded. "I will fight for you. But you need to prepare yourself. We are up against people who do not play fair." On day 3, Michaela was led into the courtroom for her bail hearing. This was her chance to fight for her freedom. But then she saw him. Judge Mark Porter. Her stomach dropped. The same judge who signed off on her warrant, the same judge drowning in gambling debt, and worst of all, the same judge who had taken a bribe from Drummond and Collins. He barely looked at her as she was seated. He shuffled papers, adjusted his glasses, and acted as if he had not helped orchestrate her arrest. Glenn stood. "Your Honor, we request reasonable bail for Miss Brown. She is a respected member of this community with no criminal record." The prosecutor scoffed. "Respect means nothing if she is a flight risk. She has connections in multiple states. We request no bail." Michaela's fingers clenched into fists. This was a setup. Judge Porter sighed, as if he had already made up his mind. Given the serious nature of these charges and the weight of the evidence, he looked up. "Bail is denied." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Michaela felt a wave of fury rise inside her. Glenn jumped up. "Your Honor, this is excessive." "Motion denied. This court is adjourned." The gavel slammed. It was over. Michaela would remain in jail until trial. As she was led away, she turned back one last time. Drummond and Collins sat in the back, smirking. They had won this round. But Michaela? She was not finished. Justice was rigged in Redwood Heights. But Michaela was about to change the game. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled. Reporters, activists, community leaders, and curious citizens all waiting to witness the trial of Michaela Brown. Cameras flashed as Michaela was led inside, her face calm but her eyes burning with quiet defiance. She refused to be broken. Across the aisle, Detective Drummond and Sergeant Collins sat in their crisp suits, smirking, as if this was already over. To them, it was just a formality. Judge Mark Porter sat high on the bench, his face unreadable. But Michaela knew the truth. This was a show trial, a performance, and the system was rigged. But what Drummond and Collins did not realize was that their carefully constructed lie was already starting to crack. The district attorney took the floor, clearing his throat before addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of deception. Michaela Brown, once seen as a pillar of the community, was leading a double life. He walked across the room, gesturing dramatically. The evidence is overwhelming, he continued. Financial records, text messages, a burner phone, and, most damning of all, the drugs found in her apartment. Michaela sat still, but inside, she was boiling. All of it was fake. Fabricated by Drummond, planted in her home, designed to destroy her. The prosecution called their first witness, an officer from the Drug Enforcement Unit. He recounted the details of the raid, explaining how they had received an anonymous tip about Michaela's involvement in a drug ring. And then, the bombshell. He pulled out a printed transcript of alleged text messages between Michaela and a supposed supplier. You will see here that Miss Brown arranged multiple drug deals through this burner phone, the prosecutor declared. This is concrete proof. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Drummond leaned back in his chair, grinning. But Michaela's lawyer, Glenn Winters, saw something that made him sit up straight. The timestamps. They did not match. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Glenn approached the witness stand with a deliberate calm. He held up the printed text messages. These messages, Glenn said slowly, occurred over a 3-month period? Yes, the officer replied. Glenn nodded, flipping through the pages. And this phone, he continued, was allegedly found in my client's apartment? Yes. Glenn paused. Then why, he said, turning to the jury, do the phone records from the service provider show 0 outgoing messages from this number? Silence. The officer shifted in his seat. That must be an error, he stammered. Glenn raised an eyebrow. An error, or evidence tampering? Murmurs spread through the room. Drummond and Collins stiffened. They had been careful, but not careful enough. Sitting in the back of the courtroom, Officer Abby Hernandez was watching everything closely. She was a rookie cop, only on the force for a year, but she had already heard whispers about Drummond and Collins. And now? She had a bad feeling. Something was not adding up. During a break, she slipped into a side office and accessed the evidence log for Michaela's case. And then, she found it. The timestamps on the drugs and burner phone were off by hours. The official record said the items were collected at 9:30 p.m. But the police body cam footage from the raid? It showed the officers leaving the scene at 9:05 p.m. That meant the drugs were added later. Her heart pounded. This was not a mistake. This was a setup. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Glenn Winters continued to expose contradictions. He pointed out how the chain of custody for the evidence was inconsistent. He questioned why Michaela, a well-educated woman with no criminal history, would suddenly run a drug operation. It was all falling apart, and Judge Porter knew it. Objection, the prosecutor said for the 5th time in 10 minutes. This is speculation. Porter quickly nodded. Sustained. Glenn gritted his teeth. Every time he got close to exposing the truth, Porter shut him down. But Michaela? She saw something new in the jury's eyes. Doubt. They were starting to see the holes. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of Drummond and Collins. Their smug expressions were starting to fade. Because deep down, they felt it too. The walls were closing in. The tension inside the Redwood Heights courthouse was suffocating. Each day of the trial, more cracks had formed in the prosecution's case. But today, everything was about to break wide open. Officer Abby Hernandez sat in her squad car, her hands gripping the thick folder on the passenger seat. Inside were documents that could change everything. Evidence logs, altered timestamps, and internal police memos. It was proof. Proof that Michaela Brown was framed. Her heart pounded. If she handed these over, she was going against her own department. She could lose her badge, her career, her safety. But Michaela was innocent. And Abby refused to let an innocent woman take the fall for corrupt cops. She took a deep breath, grabbed the folder, and stepped out of her car. The defense team was waiting. Glenn Winters and Elaine Patterson, Michaela's attorneys, were preparing for another grueling day in court when Abby knocked on their office door. She was visibly shaken. "I need to talk to you," Abby said, her voice barely above a whisper. Patterson studied her carefully. "Are you sure about this?" Abby nodded and handed over the folder. Inside, Glenn and Elaine saw it, the missing puzzle pieces. The drugs in Michaela's apartment? Planted after the raid ended. The burner phone? The logs were doctored. The officers who testified. Their statements contradicted the official timeline. Elaine's eyes widened. "This is it," she whispered. Glenn nodded. "This is how we take them down." That afternoon, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. Michaela felt it before she even stepped inside. When she took her seat, she noticed Drummond and Collins. For the first time, they did not look smug. They looked nervous. They could feel it, too. Elaine Patterson stood up. "The defense has new evidence, Your Honor," she announced, holding up the folder. Judge Porter stiffened. "What kind of evidence?" he asked, his voice tight. Elaine smiled. "Proof of evidence tampering." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Porter's face flushed. "Approach the bench," he ordered. Elaine walked forward, setting the folder in front of him. He flipped through the pages, his fingers twitching. Because he already knew the truth. He had signed off on this sham case. If this evidence went public, his entire career could crumble. "This is highly irregular," Porter said. "The prosecution has not had time to review." Elaine cut him off. "This is critical evidence that could clear my client, and the jury has a right to see it." Porter's jaw tightened, but he had no choice. "The jury may review the documents," he announced begrudgingly. Drummond and Collins exchanged frantic looks. Their empire was collapsing. Elaine walked the jury through every single piece of evidence. She highlighted the fake timestamps, the contradictions, the cover-ups. And then she dropped the bombshell. Officer Abby Hernandez took the stand. The entire courtroom froze. Drummond sat rigid. Collins looked like he wanted to disappear. Abby took a deep breath. "I found inconsistencies in the official reports," she said clearly. "The drugs found in Miss Brown's apartment were not there when officers first searched the residence. They were added later." Michaela's heart pounded. There it was, the truth, finally exposed. Abby kept going. The burner phone records were altered. The financial documents supposedly tying Miss Brown to drug deals were fabricated. The entire case was built on lies. The jury looked horrified. Even some of the prosecution's own supporters looked sick. Elaine turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we request an immediate dismissal of all charges." Judge Porter hesitated. He was trapped. He knew if he granted the dismissal, it would confirm Michaela was framed. If he refused, he risked exposing himself. Before he could speak, shouting erupted from outside. The crowd outside had doubled. Hundreds of protesters filled the streets. Signs reading "Free Michaela" and "End Police Corruption" waved in the air. News cameras broadcasted the scene live. Everyone in Redwood Heights and beyond was watching. The pressure was crushing, and Judge Porter felt it. Inside the courtroom, Drummond's face was pale. Collins had his hands clenched into fists. They had run this city for years. They had gotten rid of anyone who stood in their way. But now they were the ones trapped. Judge Porter cleared his throat. "The court will reconvene tomorrow for further review," he said. But everyone knew the truth. Michaela was winning. And for the first time, Drummond and Collins were losing control. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The jury had only been deliberating for 2 hours, but everyone knew. This case was crumbling. The truth had finally been exposed. Michaela sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. This was it, the moment that would decide her fate. The bailiff stood tall. All rise. Everyone in the courtroom scrambled to their feet. The jury filed in, their faces serious. Michaela's pulse thundered in her ears. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, cleared her throat. She looked at Michaela, and then at Judge Porter. "We the jury find the defendant, Michaela Brown." The pause felt eternal. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Michaela exhaled sharply, her hands flying to her mouth. She was free. Glenn Winters clapped her on the back. Elaine Patterson whispered, "You did it." Her supporters in the gallery leapt to their feet, cheering and clapping. Justice had won. But just as Michaela turned to embrace her lawyer, something unexpected happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A team of internal affairs agents stormed in. Gasps rippled through the room. Drummond and Collins, still in their seats, froze. The lead agent, a tall black man in a crisp suit, marched forward. "Detective Carl Drummond, Sergeant Ian Collins," he announced, his voice like steel. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, perjury, and evidence tampering." Collins stood up fast, knocking over his chair. "What? You can't be serious," he stammered. Drummond's face turned ghostly pale. "This is a setup," he bellowed. "We were doing our jobs." But the internal affairs agents weren't listening. Click, click. The handcuffs snapped shut around their wrists. The same cold steel they had forced onto innocent people was now locked around their own hands. The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters rushed forward. Cameras flashed wildly. Michaela watched in stunned silence. The men who had tried to ruin her life were now being dragged out in chains. In the chaos, Michaela noticed something. Judge Porter sat frozen, his hands clutching his desk. His skin glistened with sweat. He knew. He was next. As Drummond and Collins were led away, the lead agent turned toward the bench. "Judge Porter," he said coolly, "we need to have a word with you." The gavel slipped from Porter's shaking fingers. His breath hitched. Michaela watched as the reality sank in. His time was up. For the first time in weeks, Michaela walked outside without handcuffs. The sunlight hit her face as she stepped onto the courthouse steps. The crowd erupted. "Justice for Michaela. End police corruption!" Michaela's grandmother Bernice pushed through the crowd. Tears filled her weathered eyes. "My baby," she whispered, pulling Michaela into a fierce hug. Michaela held onto her tightly, her body trembling. "I told you," Bernice whispered in her ear. "The truth always comes out." Michaela breathed deeply. She was free. But her fight wasn't over. She had taken down Drummond, Collins, and soon, Judge Porter. But now? Now she had bigger plans. She was going to change Redwood Heights forever. The corruption scandal exploded across the nation. Breaking news: cops framed black woman, now face life in prison. Judge Porter resigns amid bribery scandal. Redwood Heights police under federal investigation. Every major news network covered the downfall of Detective Drummond, Sergeant Collins, and Judge Porter. Redwood Heights was forced to clean house. The corrupt system finally crumbles. Within days of the verdict, Judge Mark Porter was arrested. He tried to resign quietly, hoping to escape the worst, but it was too late. The same system he protected turned on him overnight. His past cases were reopened. Every shady ruling, every bribe exposed. Now, he sat in a jail cell, waiting for his own trial. His reputation? Destroyed. His career? Over. He thought he could sell justice. Now, justice had come for him. Detective Drummond and Sergeant Collins? They were facing life in prison. The FBI dug deep. Years of illegal arrests, planted evidence, beatings swept under the rug. Their own department turned on them to save itself. By the time their sentencing came, there was no way out. With public outrage at an all-time high, the city had no choice. Police reforms were passed. A new oversight committee was formed. Corrupt officers were fired. The old system, gone. And then, the final twist. The district attorney's office needed someone new to oversee police misconduct investigations. Someone fearless. Someone who knew how the system worked. Someone who had survived it. They chose Michaela Brown. She was appointed as special investigator. Her job? To review every case involving Drummond and Collins, to investigate corrupt cops, to make sure no one else was ever framed again. Michaela walked into the Redwood Heights Police Department for the first time since her arrest. Only this time, she was not a prisoner. She was in charge. The same officers who laughed at her now had to answer to her. As she walked past the old desks where Drummond and Collins once sat, a quiet smile played on her lips. They had tried to destroy her. Now, they were rotting in prison, and she was the most powerful woman in Redwood Heights. Karma has never hit harder. Alert.